like, subscribe, and share. Story 1. The Strange Case of Patrick. Wayne, Pennsylvania, isn't exactly the kind of place you'd expect weird things to happen. It's just your typical suburban town, quiet, filled with strip malls, football games on Fridays, and bored teenagers looking for something to do. I grew up here, attending a high school where nothing ever seemed to change. But there was one exception to the mundanity. Patrick. Patrick wasn't just weird, he was the kind of kid that gave everyone the creeps. From the moment he transferred to our school, he felt off. He had no friends and didn't seem interested in making any. Patrick was short, pale, and completely unremarkable in appearance, but the way he carried himself made it impossible to ignore him. Every day, Patrick wore the same dull gray hoodie, even during the summer heat, and black sunglasses always. It didn't matter if we were inside a classroom, the cafeteria, or a gym with dim lighting, those sunglasses stayed glued to his face. Eventually, even the teachers gave up on asking him to remove them. Something about the blank expression on his face and the way he seemed to stare through people, not at them, made everyone uncomfortable. And then there was the way he smelled, like old, damp laundry. It wasn't just that he wore the same hoodie every day, it was obvious he didn't wash it. He smelled like neglect, the kind of stale odor that lingered after he left a room, making people wrinkle their noses. But somehow, that wasn't the worst of it. Patrick didn't talk to anyone, but he had this strange habit that was hard to ignore. He would occasionally adopt people. If he liked someone, even for reasons none of us could understand, he would walk right up to them, look them in the eye, and say, "You're adopted now." That was it. No explanation, no conversation. Just a declaration. If Patrick told you that you were adopted, you were part of his so-called circle. The thing was, not many people were chosen. I didn't understand what it meant at the time, but now I know. Being adopted by Patrick meant you were safe from him. I was one of the unlucky few who got adopted. I guess he had some kind of weird crush on me. My friend Gabby was also one of Patrick's adoptees, but it was painfully clear that he liked her more than me. He followed her around whenever he could, never speaking, just lingering a little too close. Gabby hated it, but she never said anything not right. It was like an unspoken rule: don't provoke Patrick. My friends Gabby, Laura, Luke, and Johnny found Patrick's behavior bizarre but amusing in a twisted way. We used to joke about it when he wasn't around. But the truth is, something about Patrick unsettled us, even if we didn't admit it out loud. One afternoon after school, we were sitting on the dugouts behind the baseball field, killing time before heading home. It was a warm day, and we were all sprawled out, chatting about whatever came to mind. Eventually, the topic shifted to Patrick's crush on Gabby. We teased her mercilessly, laughing as her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. To avoid saying Patrick's real name, we'd come up with a nickname for him, something easier and less awkward than the strange old-fashioned name he actually had. But that day, Laura slipped up. She said Patrick's real name once, twice, and finally, a third time, laughing as she did. And that's when it happened. Out of nowhere, Patrick jumped on top of the dugout, clutching a baseball bat. One moment we were alone, and the next, he was standing above us like some kind of omen. It was silent to silent, and none of us had heard him coming. Patrick just stood there, his hoodie pulled tight over his head, the baseball bat hanging loosely at his side. We froze, every trace of humor draining from the air. My heart raced as I wondered how long he had been watching us. Had he heard everything? What was he planning to do with that bat? No one moved or spoke. The silence was suffocating. I gave Patrick a small, nervous wave. For a second, I thought he wouldn't react, but then he gave me a tiny nod, acknowledging me like I had passed some kind of unspoken test. Without a word, he hopped off the dugout and walked away, disappearing as suddenly as he had arrived. We sat there in stunned silence for a long time before bursting into nervous laughter. But the laughter didn't feel right. On the surface, we laughed because the situation was absurd. Who just jumps onto a dugout like that? But deep down, we were scared. None of us wanted to admit it, but the encounter left us feeling exposed, as though we had crossed some invisible line we didn't even know existed. A few weeks later, I was hanging out at Laura's house with Gabby. It was just the three of us, sitting in Laura's room, talking about nothing in particular. The conversation drifted as it always did, and at some point, Patrick's name came up again once, twice, and then a third time, just like before. Not even 10 minutes later, the front door slammed open. Laura's mom appeared in the hallway, looking startled but not alarmed. "Patrick's here," she called out casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. We stared at each other in disbelief. Sure enough, when we walked downstairs, there was Patrick, standing in the middle of the living room, making small talk with Laura's mom. When she asked him why he was there, Patrick responded in his usual flat, emotionless tone. I was summoned. We didn't know what to say. Laura's mom, apparently unfazed, politely asked Patrick to leave, and he complied without a word. But as soon as the door clicked shut behind him, we broke into a frantic discussion. How did he know? How was he always there when someone said his name 3 times? It couldn't just be a coincidence. After that, we made a pact. Never say Patrick's name 3 times again. No exceptions. Months passed, and things started to feel normal again. Patrick was still around, but we avoided talking about him, and he seemed to leave us alone. That is, until the night at Johnny's house. Johnny didn't believe us when we told him about the strange things Patrick had done. He thought it was just a dumb prank we were pulling on him. To prove his point, he deliberately said Patrick's name 3 times in a single sentence, grinning like a kid who thought he was being clever. At first, nothing happened, and Johnny laughed, calling us gullible. But then, Patrick appeared out of nowhere, jumping over Johnny's backyard fence like a shadow in the night. The laughter died instantly. We sat there, paralyzed, as Patrick stood just a few feet away, staring at us without a word. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the world. And then, just as silently as he had come, he climbed back over the fence and vanished into the darkness. Johnny was furious, accusing us of setting the whole thing up, but we were just as shaken as he was. None of us could explain how Patrick kept appearing like that, always in the right place at the right time. It was as if he could sense when we were talking about him, like some kind of twisted sixth sense. The final encounter happened on a rainy night when I was home alone. I had invited a boy over, and we were hanging out in my room, chatting as the storm raged outside. Somehow, the conversation drifted to Patrick again. When I told him the strange stories, he laughed and screamed Patrick's name 3 times, just to mess with me. Almost immediately, the rain picked up, pounding against the windows like fists. I glanced outside, and my blood ran cold. A shadow stood in the driveway, looking up at my window. It was Patrick. I slammed the blinds shut and ran downstairs, locking every door. But when I checked the front yard again, he was still there, standing perfectly still in the pouring rain. I panicked desperately. I started shouting, I'm adopted, over and over, hoping it would keep me safe. When I looked again, Patrick was gone, but the next morning, I found his hoodie in my backyard, wrapped around a few of my personal belongings, things I thought I had lost. After that night, Patrick disappeared. He never showed up to school again. No one knew where he went or what happened to him. And to this day, I still think about him. Was he just a disturbed kid who liked to mess with people? Or was there something more to his claims of being a demon? I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. Story 2. The car trap during a snowstorm. It was the kind of night that made you second-guess every decision. The snowstorm had rolled in faster than expected, and by the time my friend Mike and I got out of the liquor store, the world was blanketed in white. The snow came down in heavy, wet flakes, sticking to everything: the road, the windshield, the side mirrors. Driving was already going to be a nightmare, and we hadn't even made it to the dinner party yet. The whole stop at the liquor store was Mike's idea. We could have just shown up empty-handed like normal guests, but Mike insisted that we pick up some drinks. "We can't show up without anything, it's bad form," he'd said. I wasn't thrilled about the detour, especially since the roads were getting worse by the minute, but Mike was one of those people who couldn't be talked out of something once his mind was set. After parking, we ran inside through the swirling snow. Mike was grinning like an idiot while I grumbled under my breath about how stupid this was. "We'll be quick," he promised, already heading toward the whiskey aisle. We grabbed a couple of local craft beers and a bottle of bourbon, thinking it would be enough to keep us in the good graces of our host for the night. As we were checking out, Mike slapped his forehead. "Wait here," he said. I forgot to grab some Zins. He had just started using those nicotine pouches and was obsessed with them. I hated that he was getting hooked on them, but I knew better than to argue with him. He disappeared into the aisles, leaving me standing by the door, watching the snow pile up outside. By the time he came back, the storm had kicked up into something serious. The streets looked abandoned, and it was getting harder to tell where the road ended and the sidewalk began. "Let's get moving," I muttered as we dashed back to the car, our feet crunching through the fresh snow. I hated driving in these conditions, and the longer we stayed out, the worse it was going to get. "Relax, dude," he said without looking up. "It's just snow. We've driven in worse." That was easy for him to say. He wasn't the one driving. The drive to the dinner party was supposed to be a straightforward 20-minute trip through familiar neighborhoods. But nothing about this night was going according to plan. The snow came down in thick sheets, turning every road into an icy labyrinth. Even the street signs were barely visible under layers of frost and snow. My car struggled to find traction, slipping on corners and fishtailing when I braked too hard. After about 10 minutes of tense driving, we turned onto a side street that was usually pretty quiet. It was lined with modest suburban houses, their windows glowing warmly with Christmas lights and decorations. For a moment, I felt a little calmer. Maybe this drive wasn't going to be as bad as I thought. And that's when we saw it. In the middle of the road, there was a car stopped with its hazard lights flashing. Both the driver's side and passenger's side doors were flung open, as if the occupants had abandoned the vehicle in a hurry. The blinking hazards pierced the falling snow, casting eerie bursts of orange light across the street. I slowed the car and squinted through the windshield. The snow made it hard to see, but it was clear that no one was inside the car. It just sat there, doors wide open, like an invitation. "Drive around it," I said, gripping the wheel tighter. Every instinct in my body told me to keep going. Something about the scene felt wrong to deliberate. Cars don't just get left in the middle of the road with both doors open, especially not during a storm like this. But of course, Mike had other ideas. "We should check it out," he said, already unbuckling his seatbelt. "What? No," I shot him a look. "What if it's a setup or something?" He rolled his eyes. "You watch too many crime shows. Maybe someone needs help. You want to just leave them out here." I hesitated, my knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. Mike's curiosity had gotten us into trouble before, and I didn't feel like adding to that list tonight. "We're already late," I argued. "Let's just go." But Mike shook his head. "We can't just leave without checking." I sighed, knowing I wasn't going to win this argument. Reluctantly, I pulled the car to the side of the road, keeping the engine running. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to drive away, but Mike was already opening the door, the cold wind blasting into the car as he stepped out into the snow. I watched from the driver's seat, heart pounding, as Mike trudged through the snow toward the abandoned car. The hazard lights flickered in rhythmic pulses, casting an eerie glow on his figure. I hated this. Every second he spent outside felt like a second closer to something terrible happening. As he reached the car, he peered into the front seat. "No one's here," he called over the wind, his voice barely audible through the storm. He leaned farther inside, checking the back seat for any sign of life. That's when I saw a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. Something dark shifted behind the car. Just for a moment, my pulse spiked. I wasn't sure if it was real or if my mind was just playing tricks on me, but every alarm bell in my head was going off. "Mike, get back here," I shouted, panic creeping into my voice. He ignored me, still bent over, inspecting the car, and then it happened. The car jerked just slightly, like someone had moved inside. Or worse, someone was hiding in the trunk. Without thinking, I slammed my hand on the horn. The blaring sound shattered the silence, startling Mike. He jerked upright, looked back at me, and saw the fear etched on my face. He didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted back toward the car, slipping on the ice as he ran. I yanked the gear shift into drive the moment he slammed the door shut beside me. "Go, go, go," Mike shouted, his breath coming in sharp bursts. I didn't wait. The tires spun on the ice for a second before finding traction, and we sped away, leaving the blinking hazards behind us. My heart was in my throat as I navigated the slippery streets, my hands shaking on the wheel. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The tension in the car was suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers and the soft hum of the heater. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone chasing after us through the storm. That ... that felt weird, right?" Mike finally said, his voice shaky. "Yeah," I muttered. "I told you it was a trap." He didn't argue. For once, he looked as scared as I felt. By the time we reached the dinner party, the storm had let up slightly, and we tried to put the strange encounter behind us. The house was warm and filled with the sounds of friends chatting and laughing, a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the snow-covered streets outside. We were starting to relax when our host turned on the TV to check the news. What we saw made my blood run cold. The local station was reporting on a carjacking that had occurred less than an hour earlier, just a few miles from where we had stopped. A woman and her teenage son had encountered an abandoned vehicle with its doors open, just like the one we'd seen. As they approached to help, two men jumped out from behind a snowbank while a third emerged from the trunk, holding them at gunpoint. They stole both cars, the decoy and the victim's car, and sped off into the storm. I felt my stomach twist as the reporter gave more details. We had been minutes away from falling into the same trap. Mike and I exchanged a look, our faces pale. That could have been us. We stayed at the party for a while, but neither of us could fully enjoy it. The realization of how close we had come to disaster hung over us like a dark cloud. When we finally left, the drive home was silent. Neither of us said a word. There was nothing left to say. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept replaying the scene in my mind. The open doors, the flashing hazards, the movement behind the car. I knew I would never stop thinking about it. From that night on, I became even more distrustful of strangers. Whenever I see a stranded car on the side of the road, I drive past without a second thought. Asterisk, asterisk, I don't care if someone needs help. Asterisk, asterisk, I can't risk it. Because now I know not every cry for help is real. Story 3. The Disturbing Uncle Joseph. Some summers stick in your mind not because of vacations or fun memories, but because something changes. Something dark slips in, leaving a mark that you carry with you forever. For me, that summer took place over 30 years ago, when I was just 10 years old. My parents, my siblings, and I spent part of every summer at my grandparents' beach house. It was the kind of place that seemed perfect on the surface: warm sand, cool ocean breezes, and the sound of waves crashing on the shore. But that year, things didn't feel right. That was the summer when Uncle Joseph crossed a line I still struggle to understand. Uncle Joseph wasn't like the other adults in my family. He was different, and I liked him for it. While my other aunts and uncles treated me like just another kid in the family chaos, Joseph took me seriously. He always made me feel heard and important. He was a licensed therapist and psychiatrist, which somehow gave him an air of authority, like he understood things the rest of us couldn't. If I ever felt overwhelmed, Joseph was the first person I turned to. He was my safe space, or so I thought. That summer, something strange started happening to me. I began having intense, disturbing nightmares. They were unlike anything I'd experienced before: graphic, surreal, and terrifying. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The dreams didn't follow any specific theme, but they always left me shaken. Some nights, I dreamt that everyone I loved was gone: my family, my friends, leaving me utterly alone. Other nights, I dreamt of dark figures chasing me through endless hallways. Sometimes, I couldn't remember the details, but the fear lingered like a thick fog in my mind. After a week of restless nights, I finally told Uncle Joseph about the nightmares. I didn't want to tell my parents. I thought they'd worry or tell me I was overreacting. But Uncle Joseph listened closely, his brow furrowed with concern. As I described my dreams, he took notes in a small leather notebook he always carried with him. "This isn't uncommon," he told me in a soothing voice. "Sometimes, nightmares are our brain's way of telling us something we don't want to hear." I didn't understand what he meant, but I nodded anyway. Joseph's words always felt reassuring, even when I didn't fully grasp them. A few days later, the nightmares hadn't stopped. If anything, they were getting worse, more vivid, more frightening. I told Joseph about the latest dream, and this time, his expression grew even more serious. "I think I know what's going on," he said, leaning closer. "These nightmares, they're the result of unresolved frustration." "Frustration?" I asked, confused. He nodded. "You may not realize it, but you're probably holding in a lot of anger toward your parents. It's perfectly normal. Everyone has complicated feelings about their family, even if they don't admit it." His words threw me off. I wasn't angry with my parents. Sure, they annoyed me sometimes, like any parents do, but I loved them. I was a polite, well-behaved kid, and I rarely acted out. "Sometimes," Joseph continued, "your mind buries feelings it doesn't want to deal with. Those feelings show up in your dreams." He paused, giving me a thoughtful look. "The only way to stop the nightmares is to let some of that frustration out. It's your brain's way of asking for release." I wasn't sure what to make of Joseph's theory, but I trusted him. He was a therapist. After all, he knew how the mind worked. When he told me I needed to push back against my parents, I felt uneasy, but I was also desperate to get rid of the nightmares. "Try saying no to them," Joseph suggested. "Push boundaries a little. If they tell you to do something, don't just obey right away. You need to let your frustration surface, even if it feels strange." For the next few days, I followed Joseph's advice. I said no when my parents asked me to do chores. I argued with them when they told me to go to bed early. It felt wrong, like I was betraying them, but I kept doing it, hoping it would make the nightmares go away. It didn't. If anything, the nightmares became more intense. The imagery grew darker and more vivid, leaving me paralyzed with fear when I woke up. I started dreading sleep, knowing that every time I closed my eyes, I'd be thrown into another horrific dream. I went back to Joseph, pleading for help. Joseph looked at me with a strange mix of sympathy and hesitation, as if he knew something but wasn't sure if he should say it. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "There's one more thing we could try," he said slowly, "but it's unconventional." "What is it?" I asked, desperate for any solution. Joseph leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your brain is too mature for your young body. It's trying to escape to free itself. That's why the nightmares are happening." I stared at him, confused and scared. What did that mean? "If you have another nightmare," Joseph continued, "I'll tell you what you need to do. But you have to be ready. It's single quotes not easy." The way he spoke sent chills down my spine. What did he mean by setting my brain free? I wanted to ask more questions, but something in Joseph's expression told me I didn't want to know the answer. That night I went to bed feeling more scared than ever. I didn't want to dream. I didn't want to know what Joseph's solution was. But sleep came anyway, creeping in like a shadow. At some point in the night, I woke up not from a nightmare, but from something else. For a moment, I lay perfectly still, my heart pounding in the silence. The house was dark, and the only sound was the faint rustling of the ocean breeze outside the window. Then, I heard a whisper right next to my ear. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. It was Uncle Joseph's voice. "You're almost ready," he whispered. "Almost free." My breath caught in my throat. This couldn't be real. I wasn't dreaming, I knew I was awake. Slowly, I turned my head toward the source of the whisper. Joseph was standing right beside my bed. I screamed, kicking wildly, and he stumbled backward, his expression twisted with surprise. He bolted from the room, slamming the door behind him. For a moment, I lay there in shock, trying to convince myself that it had been a nightmare. But it wasn't. I jumped out of bed and ran straight to my parents' room, tears streaming down my face, as I told them everything: the nightmares, Joseph's advice, and what had just happened. My dad didn't hesitate. He stormed into Joseph's room, yanking the door open with a fury I'd never seen before. Joseph tried to deny everything, but my dad wasn't buying it. A heated argument broke out, and in the middle of it, my dad snatched Joseph's satchel, the one he always carried around. Inside the satchel were pages and pages of notes, handwritten entries about my dreams, articles on dream manipulation, and detailed instructions on how to induce nightmares. There were even printouts of studies on lucid dreaming and sleep paralysis. What my dad found next was even worse. Personal notes detailed observations about me, including times I'd been asleep, what I'd dreamed about, and Joseph's theories on how to set me free. Joseph didn't wait around for the police to get involved. He packed his things and left that night, disappearing from our lives without another word. I never saw Uncle Joseph again. My parents refused to tell me what happened to him, and to this day, I don't know if he was ever arrested or just disappeared into some other part of the world. All I know is that what he did left a scar, one I still carry with me. The nightmares eventually stopped, but the fear didn't. For years, I was terrified of falling asleep, afraid that Joseph's voice would come back, whispering promises of freedom I didn't understand. Even now, as an adult, I still think about that summer. I wonder how much of what Joseph did was driven by twisted curiosity and how much was something darker. Because some part of me knows he wasn't just experimenting. He was trying to unlock something, and I was the key.